Hi, it's great to be here today. Very proud to be a part of the Young Atlanticists and the Atlantic Council and a part of the Future Leaders Summit and Conference we have today. I want to just reiterate the welcome that David Wilson gave on behalf of the Board of Trustees of the Council. We're glad everyone's here. It is my particular honor to introduce our next esteemed speaker, the Right Honorable Nick Clegg, Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and Lord President of the Council. Mr. Clegg's service to the United Kingdom, to Europe, and to the transatlantic community is inspiring. His experience spans key government positions and sectors, including as leader of the Liberal Democratic Party since 2007, a member of Parliament, and a member of the European Parliament from 1999 through 2004. In each position, Mr. Clegg established his reputation at home and abroad as a strong leader and stalwart champion of transparency and accountability. His skill as a statesman has also been honed by previous experience as a journalist, as a university lecturer, and as a consultant. Today, Mr. Clegg's works hard to connect with his constituents throughout the United Kingdom as often as possible. My favorite example of that is his very unique weekly radio show called Clegg. So you try it next week. Call him up and tell him what's on your mind, ask him questions. But it's a procedure, a type of way relating to constituents that we'd be better off if a lot more political leaders emulated what he's doing on that radio show and others. He's one of the leading voices in the United Kingdom to make a pragmatic stance concerning the UK's membership in the European Union, consistently reminding citizens and elected officials alike that Britain stands tallest in the world when they stand tall in Berlin and in Paris and in Brussels. Mr. Clegg has similarly been a key steward of the Atlantic Partnership and the UK's global alliances, and the Atlantic Council have the privilege of hosting him for a speech at the release of our report on transatlantic trade and investment partnership in the 50 states, done in partnership with the Bertelsmann Foundation and the United Kingdom Embassy in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, Mr. Clegg has remained dedicated to ensuring that the United Kingdom plays a starring role in the economic recovery and the rise of Europe. He is steadfastly committed to fighting unemployment at home and emphasizing economic integration in order to catapult the UK and the EU back to the top spot in innovators in the global economy. At a time when Britain, the transatlantic community, and our global partners face real threats to the fabric of the international order, it is reassuring to have a leader as passionate about working together to address these problems as Mr. Clegg does. Thank you very much. I have the high privilege of being able to introduce to you Mr. Clegg.
So thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I actually come hot foot from my weekly radio phone-in, where I was grilled, as I am every week, just this very morning in London. Look, it's a delight to be here, and it's great to see all of you future leaders gathered here together on such an important occasion. I know you've been comparing notes and discussing and deliberating already for some time today about the future of NATO and the very many challenges it and indeed we all together face. So I just don't want to, I hope I can avoid just repeating a lot of what you've heard before, but just I wanted to make a few opening remarks and then really I want to hear from you and just ask me anything, well, within the limits of decency, anything you like. Principally, obviously, about the subject of the summit. And as Deputy Prime Minister of the host government, I want to extend our warmest welcome to this magnificent countryside and location to you. So look, if you consider when the UK last hosted a NATO summit, it's quite instructive because the last time the UK hosted a NATO summit was in 1990, in the aftermath of that epoch-changing collapse of the Berlin Wall. And the summit was about trying to navigate through what was a totally altered and much more fluid set of international relationships, because obviously the Cold War, the ideological conflict between East and West, communism versus capitalism, had sort of somewhat ossified much of the principles that shaped how nations related to each other. And suddenly that went, and the world was much more fluid, unpredictable. The fixed points that people were familiar with during the time of the Cold War suddenly went. I'm 47. I remember it vividly. I remember I was a student, a postgraduate student in the United States, in the Midwest at the time, and the Cold War. You know, that was the mental framework by which everybody. It was the prism through which everything was interpreted. It suddenly went, and it was both liberating but quite kind of unsettling. And so that summit then was all about trying to find new patterns, new shape, new strategies in a world which had changed completely around us. And in many ways, I think this summit is taking place at a time when there is yet again an unprecedented fragmentation and fluidity in world affairs, which is in many ways quite reminiscent of that of those early years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, where everyone's trying to sort of find their feet. There's huge uncertainty now. There's great fragmentation. There's great fragmentation, by the way, it's echoed in domestic politics. Domestic politics across the democratic world, here in Europe, North America, is becoming more fragmented as well. And I think there are many reasons for that. The shift of political and economic power from west to east, the rise of new economic powers in other hemispheres, the increasing salience and violence and intensity of identity-based conflict, religious conflict, ethnically based conflict, the continuing aftershocks of the collapse of the Cold War, which we can still see in parts of Europe. All of these very powerful forces are creating huge turbulence in our world order. So it's interesting that the UK finds itself hosting the NATO summit again at a time of unprecedented fluidity and lack of predictability. So I guess the exam question is, can we start to discern the patterns that will shape our world, given how turbulent and in many ways unpredictable and shapeless a lot of the conflagrations and tensions that often arise very suddenly that we face today. And I would just make really two suggestions about how to start grappling with this very unpredictable environment. Firstly, I think we have to understand that the ideological fault lines by which we have generally categorized nations, movements, political beliefs are changing very, very dramatically indeed. And when I grew up at a time when the basic fault lines were communism versus capitalism, right versus left, market versus state, public versus private. It was a very stark polarization of these opposites. And a lot of our political geography about how political parties and politicians talk about each other still hark back to that. But I think in many ways those old divisions are now giving way to something quite different. It's not actually about right market state anymore. High tax, low tax, employers, employees. Though there are, of course, continued debates on all of those issues. But actually, in many ways, they've become much more managerial debates. They've become debates where there are differences of opinion, but not starkly different ideological choices. I think where there is now a starkly different outlook is between societies which are open, which just accept and take as a given that nothing can be done in this modern world unless it is done by organizations and nations working together, so that one is condemned to that painstaking, sometimes frustrating, often complicated process of engagement with others, and societies that basically believe that the answers to the insecurities of the world are to turn themselves inwards, to indulge in the false promise of nationalism, chauvinism, xenophobia. And I think these are really quite powerful differences now. Open societies which believe in emancipation, political emancipation, economic emancipation, but believe in societies which have to embrace, not shun change, embrace, not shun the rest of the world. And those who believe that the answer to the insecurities of the world are greater insularity, protectionism, segregation, seeking out differences rather than seeking out common values and common principles. And I think you see that in a whole range of different guises and disguises. In Europe, we've just had European elections across the European continent this summer, and probably the thing that united all the very different election results was the rise of populism on both right and left. Those people who peddle very, very simple solutions to a fearful electorate. It's politically, of course, very successful. When people are frightened, they want to hear simple solutions. But it's a false prospectus, as populism always is. And then the second observation I would make is we need to kind of ask ourselves, are the institutions, international institutions, many of which were forged in the aftermath of the last World War, are they still kind of the right institutions for the kind of challenges we face, given that they're so different? Are the Bretton Woods organizations, is NATO, is the European Union, are the institutional entities which the world came together to create in a totally different world, appropriate to meet the challenges of the new uncertainties of the modern world? And my answer is yes, but only with reform, a much greater emphasis on transparency, openness, and an ability to adapt to new challenges. So NATO obviously was born in 1949 in quite different circumstances to those which prevail now, but clearly NATO is still, as the discussions this week show and will show, extraordinarily relevant to some of the threats and challenges and destabilizing forces we face, not only here in Europe, but elsewhere as well. The European Union, originally in many respects the community, a kind of reconciliation between France and Germany and other countries in the rubble of the Second World War, an economic union bringing the sort of coal and steel and agricultural economic interests together, is now, in many ways, in my view, a highly sophisticated response to the wider uncertainties of globalization, dealing with new cross-border threats, cross-border crime, climate change, and so on. So, as ever, you either adapt or die, and that is the attitude we need to take to our institutions. So we shouldn't be too precious about how our international institutions operate. We've got to accept that they face quite different circumstances to the circumstances in which they're born. And if we're prepared to adapt, if we're prepared to understand the new dividing lines in so much of international life is, as I say, between open and closed societies rather than some of the old and old-fashioned ideological distinctions, then I think we can make a lot of these organizations, about which there's quite a lot of political doubt about their contemporary relevance, we can strengthen and continue to reinforce their contemporary relevance. So those are just some very, very general, but I hope nonetheless vaguely useful and thought-provoking thoughts. And with that, I think we've got a bit of time together. I'm very keen to take any questions, comments, observations from you. Yeah.
Hi, Jonathan Bolton, United Kingdom. I think a lot of your comments on the importance of the United Kingdom staying connected with institutions such as NATO, EU, are very good. How do you, but as you've seen with the recent election, convincing the public in the UK has been very hard. What methods do you see are the best ways to help engage the public and help convince them that engagement with these institutions is still a very good thing for the United Kingdom?
I don't think there's any shortcut or surrogate to just making the case over and over and over again. There's no magic wand solution to the seductive temptations of populism, which is clearly on the rise in politics. There's no shortcut response to the ugly politics of blame, which is very much on the rise now. You see it in the rise of kind of the politics of chauvinism, identity politics, the politics of finger-pointing blame. You just have to, I don't know of any alternative, but to make the case over and over and over again that many of the things that people care about deeply, their jobs, the ability of their kids to get their feet on the first rung of the property ladder, their ability to keep their streets safe, the ability to make sure that their kids and grandkids breathe clean air and can drink clean water, none of those things can be delivered by national governments on their own. None of them. We are condemned to internationalize decision-making. And the great irony in politics these days, is a profound irony, is that just at the time that globalization demands that politicians work more together, in actually many respects, people's emotional response to the insecurities of globalization is to look more local. And so in a strange kind of way, that old phrase from Tip O'Neill, that all politics is local, has become more, not less true, even though, which is in many ways a good thing, because politicians need to be kept, and it's one of the great virtues of the British constituency system, that, that however high or low you are in the political pecking order, every week you go back and listen to people's local concerns and try and deal with them. But you've got to marry that to an ability to also explain to those very same people that politicians have got to act in concert with other countries, and that involves to and fro, compromise, negotiation, and all the kind of things that people find frustrating in a world where they want instant answers. And the intolerance of complexity is quite acute at the moment. And I think that's born of fear. When people are fearful, they want an immediate, simple, instant answer. And it's just kind of, you have to hold your nerve and say, there sometimes aren't immediate, simple, instant answers. You have to treat grown-ups. There are dilemmas to which might have several different solutions, all of which are imperfect. You just, I don't know. If you've got a better idea, tell me. But I mean, we can't carry on with what I think too many people have been doing in response to these insecurities, is kind of pretending that they have answers that they don't, pretending they have powers they don't, pretending they have solutions that they don't possess. That's a con. And all that does, of course, is it merely fosters further cycles of disappointment and disenchantment in the political process itself.
Mr. Clegg, my name is Vasil. I'm from Ukraine. With respect to Russia and the whole crisis in Ukraine, I understand EU is coordinating all the economic sanctions in Russia. But however, I'm very curious, what's your view on maybe unilateral sanctions which Britain could impose on Russia as a country which assured Ukraine of its territorial integrity? Because London could do much more to actually put pressure on the Putin's cronies who keep on enjoying their luxurious life in London. Their kids go to the public schools here, and they're here, and they have 30 billion worth of assets in Britain. They have their bank accounts here. So London itself could do much more to actually push Putin back and get him withdraw from Ukraine and actually free Crimea for then at the end of the day. Thank you.
Well, first, it's great to see you, and I'll be hosting a dinner this evening where President Poroshenko will be speaking, and I'll obviously be very keen to hear from him what his latest thoughts are on a crisis which has united Europe and the world in solidarity with Ukraine. It just beggars belief that at this day and age, in an era of international law and the axiomatic need for nations to treat each other with civility, that the territorial integrity of a proud nation is so summarily and illegally ignored as it has been by the Russian Federation. In terms of how you apply the sanctions, yeah, of course, you're right. The different countries could apply sanctions in different ways. So, I mean, Britain so happens not to be particularly dependent on energy imports from Russia, but there are other European countries that could deliver a very powerful blow to the Russian economy by being more forthright in showing how they're going to wean themselves off a reliance on Russian energy imports. So you're right, of course, everybody has sort of different bits of the economic jigsaw, and you're right, of course, Britain plays a particularly important role in the financial system. But you just deliver a much bigger punch if you work together. And that's why I think multilateral sanctions are always better than different countries herring off in different directions. By the way, I was very pleased to see that the French government finally decided to suspend the delivery of those naval ships to Russia. It's something I've been hoping they would do for some period of time. And we all need to accept, in Europe and elsewhere, that this will have economic consequences. Yes, of course it will, but it's right to do it. But it is right to do it together. And as you know, what we've done is, and Britain and our government's been at the forefront of this, we've sort of elaborated very carefully a series of tiered sanctions. And I remain of the view that an ever increasing application of tougher multilateral sanctions is the best way to show Vladimir Putin that he's becoming increasingly isolated and friendless because of his behavior. I think if people started kind of doing their own initiatives, it might be considerably easier for President Putin to kind of play off against another. And I think a united front is an extremely important principle in diplomatic and international affairs. Yeah.
Ashley Godwin from RUSI in the UK. Obviously, Scotland is holding a referendum on independence in 2 weeks' time. And I was just wondering if you could talk about what you think might be the consequences of that, should they actually vote for independence, what that means for the rest of the UK within NATO, and in turn, whether NATO could then rely on the rest of the UK as it does now. Thank you.
Forgive me, I'm not going to spend too much time speculating on an outcome that I fervently hope won't happen. And with every fibre of my being, I don't have a vote. I live in England. I'm Deputy Prime Minister of the Government of the United Kingdom, including Scotland, but I'm not Scottish. I don't have a vote. But with everything that I can sort of muster, I just so much hope that the people of Scotland will decide to vote for what is an incredibly successful family of nations. The wonderful thing about the United Kingdom in that respect, and this is what beckons for Scotland, if, as I hope it will, remain part of the United Kingdom, is you really do have the best of both worlds. You have strong nationhood, strong identity of the Scottish, the Welsh, here, in Northern Ireland, different parts of England, but part of a family of nations. And Scotland has got its own education system, its own legal system. We've devolved. Actually, it's this government that has passed new laws to devolve unprecedented new financial freedoms to Scotland. And myself and David Cameron, as leader of the Conservatives, Ed Miliband, as leader of the Labour Party, we've all said that if Scotland remains part of the United Kingdom, as we hope, we will move very quickly to provide more powers to Scotland. So Scotland really will have the best of both worlds. More autonomy, more nationhood, a stronger identity, but within a family of nations. And you won't be surprised to hear me say, as I was saying earlier, that the notion that in this day and age, given quite how insecure and uncertain and unpredictable the world is, I just don't think the answer to any of the major insecurities we face is to start creating new divisions. We are genuinely stronger together and weaker apart. And that includes the United Kingdom, as the United Kingdom. And some of the more recent arguments deployed by Alex Salmond and the SNP seem to me to become increasingly desperate, because you clearly can't make the case that it will be to the benefit of the Scottish people in terms of the economy, in terms of currency, in terms of Scotland's place in the world, to sort of yank itself out of this successful family of nations. So now, the latter stage of the debate are about increasingly specious, fictional claims that somehow, pots of gold will be discovered if Scotland were to become independent. It's just not true. It's quite the reverse of the truth. Quite the reverse of the truth. You can't deliver the money needed to pay benefits to the vulnerable through the welfare system unless you enjoy the wealth that is brought about by being part of the United Kingdom. You incur higher costs to households in Scotland if you were to pull out of the United Kingdom. So far from a sort of land of milk and honey where suddenly, no cuts need to be made, no difficult decisions need to be made. If Scotland were to pull out of the United Kingdom, actually what would beckon would be costs and cuts and uncertainty about currency. And I just, for all of those reasons, and so many more, I fervently hope that Scotland will remain part of the United Kingdom. And that's what people like me are doing our bit to campaign for that outcome. Yeah.
Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, thank you for joining us. Martin Michelot from France. I have a question. You talked about NATO adapting or dying, and I wanted to quiz you just a bit on what role the United Kingdom would play in helping NATO adapt. There is a certain concern coming from France, coming from the United States, that the United Kingdom is not pulling its weight anymore. That means, spending, that means capabilities. And I wanted to have your quick reaction and your quick response on how the United Kingdom would accompany this adaptation that NATO is undergoing.
Well, I need to say I don't accept for one moment that the United Kingdom does not pull its weight. If you look at the very considerable commitment the United Kingdom gives, has given, will continue to give to all major NATO operations. I mean, look at the operation which we're just wrapping up in Afghanistan. Britain has played a disproportionately leading role in Afghanistan, and people have sacrificed their lives in large numbers to do just that. We, as you know, even in times of austerity and fiscal restraint, have made a clearer commitment to meet the objective of spending 2% or more of national wealth on defence, and we are honouring that commitment right now. And more generally, along with France, as the country with the greatest diplomatic and military wherewithal in Europe, Britain remains, and I'm very proud of this, an absolutely indispensable part of the Atlantic Alliance. I think what you must be alluding to, quite rightly, by the way, is, of course, the vote that took place in the House in Westminster almost exactly a year ago about whether Britain would join in what, in the end, never took place, which was action in Syria. I don't for a minute think that somehow indicates some wider strategic retreat of the United Kingdom at all. No, far from it. I mean, as it happens on this, with different parties, the Prime Minister and I were united in arguing for British participation in what was then mooted as an American-led initiative to destroy chemical weapons in Syria. We didn't persuade Parliament. It didn't happen in any event. But I see that debate as a debate which needs to be judged in its own merits, not to, I mean, it would be slightly as foolish as, I know, people somehow claiming that, I don't know, because France didn't embark on by the way, an invasion that I strongly opposed, invasion of Iraq, that somehow France isn't a great nation. I mean, that's not the way we should judge each other. So, Yeah.
Daniel Lederer from Hungary. Thanks so much for being here. So you mentioned in you talked about open society versus closed society and countries which actually nourish the former or the latter. And my question would be, how do you think our institutions should deal with countries, member states who actually rather nourish the latter, so closed societies? And don't you think that the summit should talk more about values of NATO? That's it.
Certainly agree with the latter. There's no organisation is worth anything unless it's unless it's pretty clear about what its values are, and the sort of founding principle of NATO, that it is there to defend the right of nations to choose their own destiny rather than have their own identity foisted upon them, is incredibly important. And we need to restate that over and over again, and I'm sure it will be restated volubly in the final communique. In fact, I know it will be. Look, it's a difficult question to answer. It's a rather sort of generic question. But what do you do with societies, that clearly are not pointed in an open direction? Do you engage or disengage? There's a very familiar debate about how the outside world deals with the giant that is China. China is in many respects the archetypal closed society. Closed because it doesn't spread political freedoms. It still presides over significant human rights abuses, including the execution of large numbers of journalists and other people who are seeking to spread information. It doesn't give the sort of civic and political rights that we expect of an open society. You can't sort of ignore China, of course you can't. And engaging with China is essential. It's essential for the stability of the world. It's essential for everyone's economic well-being. So I think you just need to kind of strike the right balance between being, but kind of engaging, but engaging in a way that is tough and uncompromising and conditional where that's needed. We clearly see at the moment behavior by President Putin, which is completely out of step with the values and the norms that we've talked about of law-abiding open societies. And again, do you cut yourself off completely? No, but you add pressure in a kind of layered way. In other words, it's an art, not a science, and it requires a lot of sort of judgments, and of course a lot of low politics comes into these things as different nations have different vested interests. But as long as one is unambiguous and articulate about the values that one is seeking to pursue, then I think on the whole you make the right decisions. Yeah.
My name is Basir Safi, and I'm from Afghanistan, working with the Ministry of Interior. First, thank you for coming here and speaking to us. But I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the UK government for the support that you have provided for the Afghan government and people in the last decade. It seems to me that other issues like Ukraine and ISIS and other things are kind of overshadowing the Afghanistan issue. So given the fact that this political uncertainty in Afghanistan, but also the possibility of instability in case of complete disengagement or withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. How do you see the UK engagement in the future few years?
In Afghanistan?
Yes, in Afghanistan.
Well, clearly not a military one. Our military footprint ends very soon, in the coming weeks. But in terms of diplomatic, political support, we have a great deal vested in continuing to work in partnership with the Afghan authorities to secure Afghanistan's own stable future. But this has been a very, very long engagement. And at some point, you know, we need to seek to normalize the arrangements such that the future of Afghanistan is in the hands of the Afghan people, and you will know much better than I do. But the outcome and the negotiations and the arrangements which will be agreed upon following the presidential elections, the recent presidential elections, are unbelievably important. You know, if there is a successful transition, peaceful transition, broadly speaking, to a stable and legitimate form of governance post-Karzai in Afghanistan, that seems to me to be a momentous step in the right direction, because of pressures on Afghanistan. Again, you'll know better than I do. The social, economic, and other pressures are vast, are huge. So, you know, Britain will not be providing the sort of same military support, other than through the sort of training, the sort of Sandhurst-style training facility that we are establishing. But we're very, very keen to you know, explore every other opportunity to continue to work in support of the legitimate Afghan authorities. And I was personally, I don't know what you think, I was relatively pleased on the upside by how those elections were conducted. I think there was a lot of fears beforehand that they wouldn't proceed as they did. Yeah.
Katja Gershak from Slovenia. I wanted to give you a concrete example on closed societies and actually get your feedback. I'm a co-founder of Regional Dialogue, which is a small NGO, and we implement a program of human rights and justice sector reform in Uzbekistan. And we've actively engaged, and we chose to engage. And we, of course, work with, we're registered on the ground. We're the only organization registered for human rights.
And for that, we receive a lot of criticism in the West, including within British and American governments, even though now we're funded by US State Department, but particularly from big organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. And I wonder, what is your perspective on this? I mean, here's a concrete example. We've chose to engage, and we've seen results on the ground, but do you think we're doing the wrong thing?
I don't know without knowing your work better, I'm afraid. You're putting me quite rightly on the spot, but since I don't know your clearly the motives for which you do it, and the way you've expressed your question are good motives. Whether I or anybody else can judge the efficacy of them, that's something which I clearly can't do without knowing why, without knowing precisely what you're doing. I worked in a previous incarnation many years ago for 2 years in Central Asia, including in Uzbekistan, but also Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, seeking to provide EU-funded technical assistance projects to help with political and economic reform. And it's a very difficult balance to strike, of course it is. And sometimes it's very, very frustrating, and sometimes you ask yourself, is the scale of the changes you're making, dwarfed by the enormity of the countervailing forces? So again, as I said earlier, I don't think one can be absolutist, but equally you'll need to arrive at your own view. If you think the scale of what you're achieving, will leave an identifiable impression upon the everyday lives of folk in Uzbekistan, that's, shouldn't let anyone take that away from you. Equally, if the forces in favour of a more closed society are overwhelming, then you need to kind of arrive at your own view. So I'm giving you a terrifically diplomatic answer because I don't know. I don't know. But I mean, look. But you're right. Well, no. But this is the point. Look. Well, the only thing I would say is, I think as a general rule, we're all condemned for all the reasons I explained to engage, but engagement does imply a two-way process. And if you get absolutely nowhere, I mean, engagement with Vladimir Putin got nowhere. I mean, we'll talk to Vladimir Putin, but it seems to have got nowhere at all. So, of course there are certain points. You say, well, there's no point engaging. Everyone needs to decide that for themselves.
Let's all give the Deputy Prime Minister a big hand and thank him for coming.
Thank you. Okay, that way or this way? This way.